Social and cultural changes of the 1800s, before the Civil War, the Antebellum period. The country is expanding in the first half of the 1800s. The borders are growing, we're gaining lots of land, and the economy is growing at the same time. All the while, the political system is becoming more democratic. I would say by 1830, all adult white males have the right to vote. So, some of these benefits were easily accessible to some Americans, especially white males. Others had to fight to benefit from these changes. And this fight kind of starts with the Second Great Awakening, which is actually a religious movement. The First Great Awakening took place in the mid-1700s, and it increased church membership and saw more and more Americans making religion an important part of their life. The Second Great Awakening takes place about 1800 to the 1830s. And in the Second Great Awakening, like we see in this picture here, traveling preachers went around from town to town, sometimes in very rural areas, and they would hold these revival meetings where people would travel for miles to come to these big religious festivals. The old religious idea of predestination, this idea that some people are born and going to hell, and some people are born and destined for heaven. This old religious idea of predestination, this doesn't sound very democratic. It doesn't fit with what's going on in the rest of people's lives. So these Second Great Awakening preachers were spreading a message of God's love is available to all. Anyone can find salvation. In other words, make it to heaven. To get there, all you need is faith. Through faith alone, you can turn away from sin and you can go to heaven when you die. This is one of the things that makes the people of the Second Great Awakening what we call evangelical Christians. When we talk about Protestant evangelical Christianity, what we're talking about is a type of Christianity that emphasizes at least one of the following: the authority of the Bible. In other words, the words in the Bible are the words of God and therefore are true, and for the most part should be taken literally. That a person can have a personal conversion, a person can have a one-on-one relationship with God. When you pray, God hears you and God can speak to you and tell you what to do or what not to do. And this final belief of salvation through faith alone. This is what comes about in this time period of the Second Great Awakening. This idea that you are no longer born with your afterlife already determined. Instead, if you have faith in God and accept God, then you can go to heaven. And as a result, the Second Great Awakening fits better with this idea, common in America at this time, that people have the potential for improvement. People can get better. Some people who heard the Second Great Awakening preachers felt called to do God's work. So some of them might have formed a church in their community as the preacher moved on to the next town. Others might have tried to work for justice and transform society. And this is why the Second Great Awakening inspired some reform movements. And the most successful is the temperance movement. Drinking in the early 1800s was a real problem. Whiskey was the most popular drink in America. It was cheaper than milk, it was cheaper than beer, and it was safer than water. And in some communities, it wasn't whiskey, but it might have been rum or brandy. Hard liquor, not just beer, but hard liquor was consumed with every meal, even breakfast, even by children. Americans in the early 1800s drank 3 times as much hard liquor per person as Americans today. Many people, especially women, felt that drunkenness led to the crime they were seeing in society. It led to evil things like prostitution and gambling. That drinking and drunkenness led to civil disorder. That drinking and drunkenness was bad for the family. When daddy drinks, he neglects or abuses his wife and children and wastes money. And as a result, women are going to play a hugely prominent role in the temperance movement. In 1826, religious leaders created the American Temperance Society. This is a national organization that's going to join together a bunch of local level groups with the goal of getting people to abstain from hard liquor, not drinking or not drinking as much hard liquor. They're going to give traveling lectures. They're going to distribute literature. They're going to have camp meetings with pledges of sobriety. It looked a lot like the camp meetings that the traveling preachers of the Second Great Awakening had. And it's successful. By 1834, there are over 5,000 local branches, and hard liquor consumption drops by 30% during the 1830s. So it had an effect. Another reform movement of the time is prison reform, led mainly by this woman, Dorothea Dix. She studied jails and studied the conditions that prisoners were kept in, and what she found was shockingly inhumane. And by publishing what she found and pressuring states to change what they do with prisoners, she leads to a real change in the penal system across the country, and especially a change in the way that mental health is administered. She found people that were mentally ill, women that were mentally ill, locked up in these prisons, even though they hadn't committed a crime. And a lot of that's going to change as a result of her work. There's also going to be changes in public education. Horace Mann is spearheading this effort to bring free public education first to the children of Massachusetts, where he's from, and that idea is going to spread to almost every other state. Mann argues that if we're going to have a democracy and give everyone the right to vote, they should all be educated. And it would be good for the economy, and it would lift individuals up out of poverty. And as a result, Massachusetts creates a public school system, and many other states follow. Probably the most important reform movement to come out of the Second Great Awakening, though, is the abolition movement, the movement to end slavery. Remember, slavery was barely mentioned in the Constitution. Now, the Atlantic slave trade had been banned, which meant no more slaves would be entering the United States from the Caribbean or from Africa. And the people who wrote the Constitution, at least the Northerners, kind of hoped, or had hoped, that slavery would just end on its own. But the spread of cotton farming, as a result of the invention of the cotton gin, meant that slavery didn't die out. The institution did not end. It, in fact, grew during the first half of the 1800s. And not surprisingly, free African Americans are the first with organized opposition to the institution of slavery. They had their own newspaper, formed in 1827, and Frederick Douglass is the most powerful and influential speaker of the abolitionist movement among African Americans. He was a powerful speaker who spoke about his own personal experience as a slave. Really, the biggest contribution made by free African Americans to the abolitionist movement is helping with the Underground Railroad, that system of secret networks and safe houses used to help African Americans, to help slaves free the South. In big cities, free African Americans would form what were called vigilance committees to help hiding slaves continue to hide from slave catchers when they came into town. The abolitionist movement was perhaps formally started, or at least the white abolitionist movement, was started by William Lloyd Garrison in 1831 when he began publishing his anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. In that newspaper, Garrison called for the immediate and total freedom and equality, that's important, equal rights for all slaves. As an example of how the Second Great Awakening leads to these reform movements, we can take a look at the case of Theodore Dwight Weld. He heard the Second Great Awakening preacher Charles G. Finney speaking at a religious revival as part of the Second Great Awakening. And as part of that speech, as a result of that speech, Theodore Dwight Weld felt called to do God's work, to fight against slavery. That's what he felt, how he could serve God, was to end slavery. So he becomes an abolitionist, and he creates Oberlin College in Ohio. And Oberlin College is going to become a center of the abolitionist movement. The methods used by the abolitionists looked a lot like those religious revivals at the Second Great Awakening speeches. There was preaching, There were long meetings. At both, you would have found individual proclamations of faith and service. They would recruit speakers, they had to solicit financial support, and they formed organizations when the show packed up and moved on. So when a abolitionist movement came through and gave those speeches, there might have been a local chapter of abolitionists formed in its wake. Most of this is going on in northern Kentucky down through northern Ohio down through western Kentucky, as well as western New York. Most of the people that become abolitionists were upper middle class Midwesterners, typically from a small to medium-sized town in the upper north. Down south, you don't have any abolitionists. In fact, the closer the abolitionists got to the south, the more opposition and the more danger they ran into. Let's move on to women's rights, because at this time, women were second-class citizens. They could not vote, they could not own property, they could not control their own money, they could barely get an education beyond grade school. And when some women, as part of the abolitionist movement, went to an anti-slavery rally in London and were denied a seat at that rally because they were women, they came back to the United States and basically began the women's rights movement here in the United States. In 1848, a meeting was held in Seneca Falls, New York, called the Seneca Falls Convention, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, at which they issued what were called the Declaration of Sentiments, where they demanded that all women be given the right to vote and be given equal legal rights in the United States. Now, it won't be until 1920 until women gain the right to vote, but there are some gradual successes for the rest of the 1800s. Another important part of the women's rights movement was Sojourner Truth, an African-American woman who challenged and stepped up against the idea that women were weak and not capable of some of the things that were denied to them by white male society.